Back during the ancient world and the Middle Ages, the ship represented the pinnacle of the military. The ship was a sacred thing, and as time went by, it was those who ruled the waves that became the most powerful nations. But during the Age of Discovery, when ships were discovering new worlds and crossing vast oceans, life was tough for sailors. The Age of Discovery was also an era of mutiny. When an aggrieved crew turned against their captain, all hell could break loose, and there was nowhere to hide. That's why some particularly horrifying punishments were reserved for out-of-control sailors. Welcome to keel hauling. Our viewers have likely seen the movies that depict mutinies on ships or sailors that no longer follow commands. For their transgression, the punishment had to be quite severe, because when you're in the middle of the ocean, you just can't afford to let things slide. On the other hand, if a captain is too stern, this might create a conspiracy to take him out, and that's what we call mutiny. Maybe the most well-known of those was the mutiny on the Bounty. A captain had to be hard but fair, lest he lose the respect of his crew. The most common types of punishment then were not keel hauling, which could be said to be the most severe form. It was most likely that the offending sailor would receive some strokes of the cane, or worse, the whip. He might simply be tied to the mast and left to think about what he'd done. But let's say a sailor had been part of a mutiny, and that mutiny had failed. Or what if the villains of the seas, the pirates, had wanted to come down hard on someone? What was the worst thing they could do? Well, they might be hanged, but it was a particularly painful type of hanging because rather than being dropped, the person would be pulled up while his head was on the noose. He would be run up something called the yardam, which was part of the timber cross-section of the mast from where the sails are set. There was a case of hanging by the yardam in 1860 that happened to the Royal Marine John Dallinger on the HMS Leven. There was also cases where men were thrown overboard, but in one infamous instance of this happening, the men hadn't committed a crime. The crime was against them. It's now known as the Zong Massacre, and 130 slaves were thrown overboard a British ship. And then there's the punishment you might have all heard of from reading books or watching movies about pirates, and that's the ghastly treatment that involved having a man to walk the plank and into the ocean. Despite this being the most recognizable punishment in the era of pirates, it's mostly a thing of fiction. There have been some recorded instances, such as a mutineer in the 18th century confessing that he had made his officers walk the plank while blindfolded, but the details are sketchy on this, and many believe that it never happened. There are some instances that sound true and were reported in the newspapers of the day, but walking the plank was certainly a rare thing to happen. So now we come to keel hauling, which definitely did happen and you might argue was a worse punishment than any of the above. The keel of the ship is like the backbone of the ship. It's the bottom part. When someone is hauled under the keel, this is called keel hauling. That person might have been hauled with ropes from one side of the ship to the other, or even worse, dragged the entire length of the ship from what are called the bow and the stern. As you can imagine, this would be rather unpleasant, to say the least. You might think, well, if the operation was short enough, at least you could hold your breath and make it to the other side. You might then dry yourself off, issue some apologies, and be back to work. That wasn't really the case though, because being bashed up against the ship was a painful affair. There was a good chance bones would be broken or a head injury could mean the person was pulled up dead. It was actually quite an extreme form of punishment because the ships are generally not smooth on the surface of the hull, the part of the ship that floats in the water. These wooden ships' hulls were covered in barnacles, which are those ultra-sharp crustaceans that stick to things. We are sure some of you have experienced slipping on a rock and being cut by these razor-sharp things. Now imagine your body being hauled against them with pressure. The keel-hauled man would be shredded all over his body and he might come out looking like a victim of Freddy Krueger. It was a fate worse than marooning, which is when pirates just left people to die on a deserted island. Jokingly, some pirates called this making someone the governor of an island. Back to keel hauling. Sometimes weight was placed on the man so the people pulling him had more control of the movement of his body. There was an upside and a downside to this. He might have actually missed all those sharp barnacles if he went low enough, but he might also have drowned. This punishment was rare to say the least, but there have been depictions of it in paintings going back to ancient times and the Middle Ages. There is this picture that was sketched sometime in the 15th or 16th century England. It was discussed in 1880 in British Parliament when one politician asked the Secretary to Admiralty about an instance of keel hauling that had been reported in Italian newspapers. It allegedly happened on the HMS Alexandra, but the Navy denied it had ever happened. There is also a well-known painting that's called The Keel Hauling of the Ship's Surgeon of Admiral Jan van Ness. The event happened on a stationary ship in front of many spectators, but it seems the punishment was never supposed to kill the offender, but only act as a warning to others who thought about not towing the line. Pun intended, that expression is a reference from the Navy. Historians have written that keel hauling did happen in the Dutch Navy. They described as we have, saying that the man was lowered on pulleys and ropes into the water and weights were attached to him. He was then pulled back up the other side of the ship, although it's also written that he might have been given some time to get his breath back and then it started again. This was apparently much more severe in the winter when the water was freezing cold, and severe injury could happen due to the man hitting his head. It wasn't supposed to be a death sentence though. In the case of this keel hauling, it was under the command of a 17th century Dutch admiral named Jan Janse van Ness. We just can't find any resource that tells us what the guilty surgeon had done to deserve this wicked treatment. Keel hauling is described in a book called A Relation of Two Several Voyages Made into the East Indies that was published in 1700. Again, it's the Dutch that did it. Here's an excerpt from that book. He that strikes an officer or master of the ship is without hopes of pardon to be thrown into the sea, fastened by a rope, with which he is thrown in on one side of the ship, and drawn up again on the other. And so 3 times together he is drawn round the keel of the ship, in the doing of which, if they should chance not to allow rope enough to let him sink below the keel, the malefactor might have his brains knocked out. It sounds like the lower the man sank, the better his chances were of keeping his head intact and not being sliced by barnacles. There are other cases of keel hauling that were described in the journal of Dutch admiral named Maarten Harpenschoen Tromp. In 1639, he described something similar to the above. In the 18th century, a piece of writing by an Englishman said the English don't do it, but the French do. One instance is described when a French sailor went around the ship 5 times. It was published in November of 1869 in a publication called Onward Magazine. The person who witnessed this and wrote about it said the sailor had injuries of the most serious nature, or death itself, certain of being the result. Alright matey, now that you've gotten through this video, let's stick together and watch another. We've picked 2 for you, so choose this one over here or this video here. Pick now, or you might end up keel hauled yourself. Just kidding. Or are we?